Hello, everyone. My name is Reese Lindmark, and you are listening to The Reese Show. On the show, we're trying to clarify what a good future looks like. I know we're all a bit sad about late-stage capitalism, and we want to transition to something, but we don't really know what's next. So, on the show, we interview experts about what is emerging, this beautiful future vision that we can all lean into. I hope it gives you a sense of purpose and clarity about the future. If you like the show, feel free to do something about it. You can leave us a 5-star review. You can tell your friends. You can name your first child Reese. Whatever makes you happy. And if you really dig it, we have an online school called Root, where we help folks understand these root level systems to find our route forward. We have cohorts of world-class systems thinkers that run every couple of months. So if you're interested in that, check us out at root.co. That's ROOTE.co. Thanks. Hello, listeners. Today I'm excited to chat with Casper ter Kuile. Casper is helping build this beautiful world of joyful belonging in the midst of these enormous changes in how we experience community and spirituality. And he's doing this in a variety of different ways. He's the author of this cool book, The Power of Ritual, a ministry innovation fellow at Harvard Divinity School, a co-host of this kind of funny, amazing, very popular podcast, Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, and also the co-founder of this startup, Sacred Design Lab. Casper, thanks for being on the show and welcome.
I'm so glad to be here, Reese. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're excited to dive in. And Casper and I were kind of chatting beforehand, and we were just like, we're just going to nerd out about the future of meaning and the future of spirituality and religion and hopefully learn from Casper today about how he's thinking about these things. But before we kind of do that, I want to ask you, Casper, you are into all this spirituality and meaning and religion stuff, but you're also, as far as I could tell from the internet, you're not actually religious. How does that work? Why have you ever thought about, turning to the dark side or whatever?
Yeah, well, so I grew up in England, which, is a much more secular country than America. Like 6% of people go to church on a Sunday. So it's a very, very different context. And I didn't grow up in a religious family. My parents weren't religious. My grandparents weren't religious. It was just far away from me. I honestly thought people who were religious were a little weird. And definitely when I came out in my teens, I was like, okay, religion's either irrelevant or cruel, right? Because of its anti-women, anti-gay, anti-everything stance, at least in the way I experienced it. So I was like, fuck you, religion, honestly. But the thing that I became more and more interested in, especially as I started my work at first as a climate activist, I was really involved in the young people's movement around the United Nations Climate Convention. And I started to realize that the way I was trying to solve the problem was kind of by looking at changing policies. And when that didn't work, starting to understand how power and politics works. And then ending up in this place where I was like, but the way in which we're thinking about these questions, the very paradigms through which we understand what we're supposed to be figuring out, that's where the real problem is. And so, is nature a resource for us to use, or are we part of a living ecosystem inherently implicated in relationship? Those are two very different starting points to think about fossil fuels, for example. So I started to think more and more about paradigms. And that's when I was like, well, who has tried to do culture change? Who has tried to shift the way in which people think about life for millennia? Well, hello, it's religion. And so I came to the Divinity School, honestly, as a self-described, gay atheist, being like, well, I'm just going to learn about religion, and then I'm going to take those little things and I'm going to apply them over here in what I want to do. But what happened to me while I was in Div School was a total reframing of what religion is. So if you ask me, are you religious? On the one hand, do I attend a congregation? No. Do I describe myself as affiliated with a particular denomination? No. So I'm not religious. But on the other hand, I'm praying every day. I take a Sabbath every week. I have, rich relationships of mentorship and guidance. I have, values that I try and put in action in how I spend money and how I live my life. And do I feel part of something bigger than myself? Yes. So I am religious. I essentially think that the category of how we think about religion is no longer fit for purpose. And that's part of my whole work, is thinking about, okay, so what next?
Yeah, no, that's a great overview. And I think that it's funny. I mean, just hearing 6% in England is like, wait, what? Me growing up in America, it's like everybody was religious. Everybody goes to church or whatever. So how do you think about? I mean, it is. I do like that reframe on religion as something that you can kind of, that has these kind of habits and practices and rituals and meaning and whatever. What's the praying that you do every day, by the way? Is it like a gratitude journal? Like I do a gratitude journal every day.
Beautiful. Well, so this is one of the other questions is like, how do we describe the very things that we're doing? Because you could describe it in a very secular way. It's like, yeah, I go through three things that I'm grateful for at the
Yeah,
end of
exactly.
every day.
In my
But
app.
listen, yeah, on your app, exactly. Or like some couples will do it before they go to sleep with their partner, right? Like there's so many ways in which that happens. And then if you look at the tradition, and I'm most familiar with the Jewish and the Christian traditions, like one of the best ways of describing prayer is gratitude. Like Meister Eckhart, this wonderful mystic of the medieval era in Europe, describes if the only words you ever say in prayer are thank you, it would be enough. And so for me, so much of what we have to figure out is what's the right way to talk about these things. So for me, my practice, and it's changed since COVID, honestly, but like I live in an apartment building in Brooklyn. At the end of every day, I have a friend who I do this with. She texts me just a little bit of poetry or some beautiful couple of lines of text, and I go to the top of the roof and I take 10 kind of conscious breaths as I look out over the city, and I say these words aloud. And I've ended up saying the Lord's Prayer just because that's the one I learned in school, in middle school, because I had to say it every day. But I changed the first word because it's like, Our Father who art in heaven is the classic Christian language. But I always try and find a new word for God. So I might be like, oh, great tree who art in heaven. Or like if there was in the poem, there was something about singing, I'm like, oh, great song. So there's a creativity in naming God, which in itself is a beautiful tradition of finding different words for the divine. So anyway, that's a little insight into what that looks like.
I love that. It's cool to hear different people's kind of, morning rituals or end of the day rituals. That
Yeah.
sounds like a really nice one. Something though that I'm hearing from you as you talk about your own, you're like, hey, no, I am kind of religious in these ways. Something that I think a lot of folks might push back, or even I kind of think
Yeah.
about where I'm like, okay, what's the future of religion and spirituality in society? It's like, you're doing all these things, but you're doing them. There's no like organized institution or like, you're doing some community stuff, but like, how do
Yes.
you think about community and networks and that kind of stuff, like playing a role here?
It's the major difference in how, at least in kind of popular language, we differentiate between spirituality and religion, is that spirituality is a personal endeavor and religion is a corporate one, right? It's one that we do communally. And I think there's some value in thinking about that difference. I also think it's wholly insufficient to understand. And so what I want to say is that anything that we do just by ourselves, I find, it can be a great first step, and that's often as more of us who are outside of religious institutions are trying to grapple with our interest in these questions. Right, we're gonna try something on our own first. That whether it's a Headspace app, whether it's buying a beautiful crystal, or you're laying tarot cards, whatever it is, that absolutely makes sense. But if it only stays there, I think it can be quite dangerous because we can either get in our own heads that, wow, we've really found the thing and it's the best, and like no one else's opinion matters. Or frankly, and this one worries me more, is that we stay in a sense that we are uniquely bad. This is one of the most beautiful things I think about religious worship, especially in a frame of confession, is that we remember that everyone else is shitty too, right? Like there's a sense of like, yeah, we've all fallen short of who we want to be in one way or another, and that it's a relief to remember we're not the only one. So I really want to affirm your instinct of looking for something that's more communal. I think one of the challenges is that our imagination for the future of religious life is very much shaped by a congregational model, right? This idea that we gather once a week and 100 plus people in the same building. And that, I think, is culturally no longer attractive in the way that it was. It doesn't have the same viability or frankly financial viability as it used to. Our work lives are different. Our family lives are different. There's a different structure that needs to hold us. So one of the things I'm most passionate about is being part of a small group of people who rigorously come together to do that kind of confession and a mutual support and accountability on a regular rhythm. So whether it's once a week or once a month, being part of a small group where you can really be honest about what you're longing for, what you're struggling with, what you need help with. I think is one way in which we can think about the structure of religious life, because it has that communality, but it also fits into the kind of lives that more and more of us are living today.
Yeah, I like that. I think And I think that, yeah, doing something yourself, that's like how it starts. And then it reminds me too of like, just wanting to connect with others. And I'm reminded of like I've hiked a long trail, this Colorado Trail, 500 miles. And I thought it was going to be like a connection
Wow.
to nature,
Yeah.
but that was true. But it really was, at I made this like coffee table book about it, and like I put a little equation because I'm kind of mathy, and it was like people in nature is greater than people is greater than
Yes.
nature. Where it's like it was all about
Yes.
the people side, and I came in with the wrong expectation. Do you think though that so I like what you're saying about the congregation, like the small or like big congregation might not work anymore. Like we don't all
Right.
have to be in these big churches. I kind of, one way that I might think about it is like as these kind of layers. And so for me, I'm kind of,
That's right.
I might be in the like the techno-utopian. That's probably like the new church that I'm the most part of or
Yes.
something, and maybe
Well, I want
go.
I want to build on that because I think you're exactly right. Because those small groups should not live in isolation, right?
Yeah.
They need to understand themselves as part of something bigger. And the something bigger might be communicated, for example, through a podcast, right? Or it might be through a festival that everyone goes to once a year. Hello, something like Burning Man, right?
Exactly.
So you see how those structures kind of already exist, because a small group by itself will feel like we're only 5 people. Like, what is this going to do? But if I know that there are hundreds of other small groups out there, I can actually still feel part of something bigger than myself, which is an absolutely essential piece, I think, of what religious life is about.
Yeah. So let's dive in on that for a second, because yeah, we're definitely hitting on the same thing. And I think, Burning Man's like the easiest, like, oh, you're in the techno
Right.
utopian, whatever. Like, but then for something like maybe like social justice activism, or for these
Yes.
other kinds of new religions, like, is it like something like a women's march, or something like, I don't like, how do you think about those bigger events that are like Burning Man, but for these other kind of new age things?
I love that question. I think you're totally right to point to social justice movements as being one place where people feel that. Fandom is another place that I would look, and I'm familiar, of course, with the Harry Potter fandom, having
Maybe a
been
little
part
too
of,
familiar, to be honest.
definitely having been part of it. But the way in which people are generative in these spaces, I think, is one way that you can look in terms of how meaningful it is for them. So, are people writing fan fiction? Are they creating YouTube series? Are they making art? Are they talking about it and creating new things based on the shared experience? Right? Whether that's in fashion, whether it's in poetry, like it doesn't matter what the medium is. But there are other things, like, for example, people who are part of gyms who then participate in a CrossFit Olympics, or a CrossFit kind of annual competition, or people who run Spartan races, or right, people who attend conventions around drag. There are so many ways, I think, in which people who might feel like they're a small part of the puzzle can then feel part of something bigger. It happens in these spaces. And it's not that each of these things that I've mentioned is a religion, but I think you can see religious elements to a greater and lesser degree across all of them. And that's another kind of key shift, I think, of how we think about religion is, we're accultured to, let me say that differently. We're accustomed to thinking about religion as this one category of like, okay, you're Reformed Jewish, you go to this synagogue, these are the rituals you have, this is the family tradition that you have, and it all fits in this one box. And I think more and more things are becoming kind of unbundled. So you might have been raised in a multi-faith home. You might live in a neighborhood and have friends that come from many different traditions. You might have nothing, but you've taken up yoga and meditation, and now you have a little something. So we're mixing together more and more pieces of a spiritual or religious puzzle. And so we can't look in any single place and be like, this is where religion is happening. But it's more like a layer of experience that goes across all different parts of our lives. I think that's one way in which we can kind of shift how we think about what religion is and where it's happening.
Yeah, I love it. Thinking about it as a layer, I think, is good. And I think a way that I often think about it too, I think, is, or it also kind of reminds me of this like networked individualism, where we're all
Yes,
kind of individuals, but we're also like part of this network. We can see the other folks. And I think you just
that's
hit
right.
on a lot of the bigger kind of, with some of these other things, like going to these bigger Tough Mudder races or whatever. There's always like having the levels is really important for folks. Do you think, one thing that makes me think about is like, as we're wrestling with this idea of like what is a religion, like how should we think about it in comparison to these other kind of
Mm,
collective shared orders? So
yeah,
something like a company, or something like a market, or like a nation state. It's like these things all provide us, as communities of people, with meaning and community, and can meet some of our basic needs or whatever sometimes. So like how should we be thinking about religion
yeah.
compared to those things? Is it competing with them, or yeah, how do you think about that?
Well, now you're venturing into a fiercely contested sociological conversation.
Oh, I
Because
wasn't even aware. Oh no.
no, in a good way, in the sense that, scholars of religion have this conversation always, which is, well, what is religion?
Yeah.
Like what counts, what doesn't, what are the boundaries of it? What, do you have to believe in God for you to be religious? So many of our assumptions, certainly in popular culture, come from a very Christianity oriented worldview, right? And not just Christian, but really Protestant. The idea that, do you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior? That's what makes you religious or not, right? That's a very simplistic understanding of belief being the cornerstone of religion. Well, if you look at Judaism or many traditions outside of Christianity, what actually often really gives someone a sense of identity is the practices that they have. What are the rituals? Do you venerate elders? Do you keep the Sabbath? Do you eat a certain diet? Do you travel to a certain place at a certain time of year? Right? Do you keep the commandments? Do you speak a certain language? There's all sorts of other ways beyond just belief that's important in religion. That was a bit of a preamble, but all of that is to say that there's different answers to your question. For some people, the fact, Paul Tillich, for example, a great theologian in the 20th century, said that what makes something religious is if it concerns itself with ultimate meaning and value. Mm-hmm. So if you're just here to earn money, right? If you're a corporation and your bottom line is the finances, you want to get rich, like that's not concerning itself with ultimate meaning value. I think we can all agree on that. Now, it gets a little more interesting if you are a WeWork or a Facebook and you're like, well, we have this big lofty mission. I mean, we can all see very quickly that they're falling short of it. So that's a different conversation. But the lines become much harder to say exactly what is where, especially when people start talking in a language which is about we're all on this joint mission, and this is the culture that we believe in, and these are the rituals that we do. And suddenly you're like, well, where is the boundary of corporation? Where's the boundary of religion, right? Where's the boundary of fan community? Where's the boundary of religion? And I don't think there is a strict boundary. I think to some extent what you can ask yourself is, what do I want from this? And that maybe is the most helpful kind of internal measure. Like, is this the place where I go and think about ethical concerns? In our research while we were at the Divinity School as students, I was looking at, with my colleague Angie Thurston, at how fitness communities especially were not just places where people were going to work out, but like they would bring a question like, my mother has cancer, what should I do? Should I move home? They would bring that to their fitness instructor. They would text their SoulCycle instructor, should I divorce my husband? Mm-hmm. And here's a 23-year-old woman who's great at fitness and like being emotional in front of people on a bike, but like she's not being trained in pastoral care and counseling, right? But nonetheless, people are bringing those questions to these spaces. And so for me, that's when it becomes kind of religious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I kind of love that reframe too, because it's like, okay, there's the institutions themselves, but then there's really, and again, it goes back to like the networked individualism piece. Like, what are you looking for? What needs are you looking to get met? And you're like, okay, it reminds me of a friend on Twitter who wrote recently that like she gets her needs for like she has a community where these are all just like random Discord communities, but it's like, here's the community that she does her value stuff with, Bentoism. Here's the community that she does her work stuff with, On Deck. And so she just has these kind of, and she knows what she wants out of each of them. So I think that's a good way to frame it.
Reese, I want to meet your friend, because one of my biggest questions that I don't know the answer to is, how are we going to organize it? And I love that you point to Discord, because I think new technologies are part of the picture, which is like, okay, so if everything is like remixed and unbundled and you're having to navigate 8 different places for the 8 different parts of your life that you want to tend to, what's going to hold that all together? Because as everything becomes more personalized, we also get more and more like uniquely situated, right? Who else is going to have those specific 8 communities as their 8 communities? No one. And so I think there's an element of feeling kind of cosmically alone, even though we're meeting something more and more specifically ours at the same time. And so I think one of the things we're looking for as a culture is like, what are the new organizing principles around which we can negotiate those 8 different parts of your life? And maybe the answer is Discord.
And we're here. This has all been a preamble, and we're trying to sell you on Discord. It's a new, that's funny. No, it is. I agree with you. I think it's a tough, and I actually want to highlight one. Well, there's 2 pieces of that. One is the like, what is the underlying coordination technologies that we will
Yes,
have available to us to organize both religions, but also other kinds of things,
that's
And I
right.
think that's an outstanding question, but lots of these online forums or online message boards or what Reddits and also messaging communities like Discord are part of that. I also think, and the kind of bigger spaces like Twitter and being part of like a hashtag. I don't know, you might be part of like
Yeah,
the, future of religion hashtag or whatever.
yeah,
I also, one thing though I want to dive in on there for a second is you said you might feel cosmically alone. And I think that is, and it kind of goes to your definition too of like religions. It's like these big questions. Maybe a religion is a thing that deals with a big question. And it makes
mm.
me think about, your book, the power of habit, the power of
The power
ritual.
of ritual.
Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And both the ritual that you do every day, and for me, some of these like meditation things where you can kind of go deep
Yeah.
and be interaction with a presentist self and with these anti-fragile attractors that are like can keep
Mm.
you kind of interested in them for a long time or whatever. But there's also what they don't do is they don't have an answer to the question of like what it all
Hmm.
means. And for me
Hmm.
personally, the answer is like this egoistic, not egoist, optimistic nihilist perspective, which says nothing. It means nothing. And the
Mm.
meaning that you get out of it is just in the day-to-day experience. And
Mm.
so I don't know. It just makes me think about like, it also is like, I know this is kind of a ramble now, but something that the old, quote unquote, older religions have, something like Christianity, it has an answer to the question of death. And like, it says, hey, you're going to have an afterlife or whatever. And I think a lot of these new religions, like something like, technoutopianism says like, oh, you'll be able to make a long life, or something like social justice is like, you'll be in the memories of people, going forward. But like,
Hmm.
I don't know how new religions are going to answer this question of cosmic aloneness and the meaning of it
Yeah.
all. What do you think about that?
I'm so glad we're in conversation. That's a beautiful question. Um, well, I'll tell you what I think slash want, and then let's talk about what we see happening.
Cool.
I think one of the most uh, honest ways in which I would want to structure a future of religion is that it doesn't center answers, but it centers questions,
Mm.
and that it what it does is help you ask the question better. So, for example, I've really shifted how I think about scripture, right? About sacred texts, that it isn't a place that gives you answers, but it's a place that you can go for good conversation about the question, because it's a description of someone else's experience that you can use as a mirror for your own and say, hey, what resonates here? What's clarified? What's challenged, right? What did I assume that is not assumed here? Gosh, I hadn't thought about that. And that's what good preaching does, is it helps us read a scripture differently. Like, it helps us find new insight. Because I think one of the foundational mismatches between our culture, which is inherently skeptical of hierarchy and authority, that as soon as you come in and you're like, okay, I'm a bishop, so I'm going to tell you what I think, or like, I'm the Pope and this is the answer. It's like, everyone's like, no, like, who gave you that right? Right. And rightly so, frankly, because those power structures are so embedded within patriarchy and sexism and everything else. So that would be my first kind of salvo, is to say, let's center questions, but not just be like, oh, you have to figure this out on your own. Let's resource you with community and with ancient wisdom and contemporary insight from new science and technology that will help us, just grapple with that question better. I think in terms of how, the assumption that a lot of religious institutions might be coming in with is that they will lose something inherent about who they are if they let go of some of the traditions or the certainties. But I don't want to paint too negative a picture, because healthy religion has always said that faith is not the opposite of doubt, right? It's not certainty. It's actually making space for the questions, making space for doubt. So I don't want to do a disservice to these traditions at their best. But it's more frightening, right? Like, if you're looking for security, sometimes what you're looking for is answers, and there's definitely people who will be willing to give them to you, but they might not always have your best interests at heart, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I think, and I like your phrasing there of like religions in the future centering on questions, not answers. And yeah, just being in relationship to those questions and what that
Hmm.
means. And what you've said about like, religions at their best give a sense of yeah, this kind of, yeah, like being in Yeah, just like, yeah, being in relationship to a question and not providing the,
Mm,
we want the security and the certainty, but it's like, to be able to provide this like, open-ended question thing seems better. How though, I guess I'm curious, just in your life, how do you
mm,
think about, the big question or the cosmic importance and like the connection to the afterlife or non-afterlife? Like, how are you trying to
yeah.
solve that in your own life?
Yeah, I mean, this is the reality of human psychology is that I want different things at different times, right? Like there are moments when I want to be comforted and where I want a certainty or a stability of an answer, and then there are moments where I ridicule that and actually I want openness and unknowingness, and then there are moments where I just want you mentioned optimistic nihilism. Maybe I'll just go towards a full-on nihilism where it's like nothing matters. All I'm doing is Mario Kart. And so um, I guess the honest answer is it changes, and I think that is just fine. I don't need to land somewhere. I think part of the beauty of life is the willingness to change and to hear about someone's experience of like feeling the presence of their mother who had died 10 years ago as they're baking something and be like, I wonder what that really is about. What does that mean? I don't think there's like a ghostly mother figure behind her as she's baking, but like there's something real going on here, even if it's just in her head. And to
Mhm.
quote Dumbledore, just because it's going on in your head doesn't mean it's not real. So
Mhm.
I'm just throwing questions back at you because I don't have a concrete answer. But I'll tell you this: that going to divinity school and feeling like I could ask these questions and learning better how to do it has made me a happier, better person. And ultimately, maybe that's the one, like finite thing that I can point to is like, how do we live our lives, right? Are we just and merciful? Are we kind and generous? Are we forgiving? Are we an asshole? And no doubt, it can be both of those things. But I hope that by engaging with those questions faithfully, that you can see the outcome, in how we live.
Totally. No, I like that. I think that there's, yeah, but it's also interesting just to hear your own, and I think for me, it can change day to day too. And it's like, I think it's just a funny, or when I think about it, like, and if I put on my like, oh, it would be better if the world had had more, if everybody went to Burning Man, if I put on that hat, I've only been to
Yeah.
Burning Man once, but like, then one thing that I think that the like new religions need to solve is like the questions around the afterlife. And so I just think to like
Mm.
share the people who are in these like, post religion religions are kind of their answers to the afterlife, I think, are kind of crucial for like quote unquote convincing folks or whatever. Um it
Can
makes
I can I ask you about what that looks like in a kind of techno utopian worldview? You mentioned the promise of a longer life.
Yeah.
If I put on my critical glasses, what I see is a fear of death and a sense of being like beaten by life, and that somehow my masculine strength has been undermined by the frailty of humanity. So I can give you a whole spiel about how this is really a fear-based thing, and I think that's only half the story, but I want to hear you talk about what's the other half, like what's the beautiful wish in this, like what can I learn from that kind of vision about the future.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think it's and thank you for the curious question. I think it's, and let me say that I'm like, I'm maybe I'd call myself like 30% techno utopian or
Yeah.
something. So maybe I'm
I
not.
love it. That
um
sounds like a healthy mixture.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. You got to have a little bit of it, but not too much. Well, I think it's funny because I think it is. I mean, it's funny because it's a classic thing where it's like in, I live in San Francisco and hang out with a lot of like VC types and tech founders. And I think that stuff is really good. And also it yeah, you can really see people being pulled towards these intense meaning and purpose things. And like the two key ones are just
Yeah.
like Elon Musk and space travel, making
Yeah.
humanity a a spacefaring civilization. That is it both is it it has some truth to it, which is cool, and we should be pulled towards it. And it's like the amount of weight that it pulls might be, too much because it has this like crazy good purpose and meaning meter,
Hmm.
and so I think there's that side, and the other side is like, yeah, the longevity movement, which are, I think your skepticism is all right, which is that these folks are, the that people ain't nobody want to die, at least not at 86 or whatever. And
Yeah.
so like trying to live longer, and people will paint the like positive side is that what people want to do is they just want to do better science, and they just want to make sure that like we have 200 years ago half of kids died before the age of 5. Right
That's
now it's
right.
less than 5%. So like we're so excited about this. Like how can we
Amazing.
do that as well, but for like our own like more lives, like just make it so that like more people can live longer and make it a choice or whatever. So I think there is a lot of goodness and truth there, and I also think it has this kind of weird pseudo spiritual, pseudo religious thing that pulls people towards it. Does that answer your question? Or
Yeah, no, it makes sense, and I think it speaks to this wonderful paradox of so much of the energy that you're describing is one of progress, right?
yeah,
We want to do better, we want to advance in science, and we want to live longer, and we want the curve is going up and to the right. Like
yeah,
that's the future that we want to be in. And that is part of, I think, in so many different spiritual and religious traditions, right? That sense of growing in virtue, or becoming more faithful, or whatever it is, right? So that echoes. I think the bit that's missing for me, and the thing that I find hardest as well, is the willingness or the ability to just be present to suffering, and because the world is beautiful and exciting, and it's also awful and painful, and I guess what I'm always looking for in a community or in a movement is like, does it have both of those things? Because that's where you have courage and humility. You have vision and the okayness with what is. And those people who can do that, like they're the real visionary masters of. I don't know.
totally.
I struggle with that a lot. Like I don't want to be near pain. Who wants to be near pain?
Yeah, pain sucks.
No.
It's like,
It sucks.
yeah. I think I love what you said there, which is that, and I think it's true, which is, this constant focus on positive sum dynamics and on,
That's right.
pushing forward and all stuff. And it's like, okay, that is good. And also like, let's just like sit for a second in the pain of others, like really empathize
Yeah.
with or understand this. And so I think, and the way that maybe folks would answer, like there's this, and maybe I'll share this with you afterwards, there's this great Our World
Yeah.
in Data post about it, which says 3 things, but it's a very quantitative answer to your question, and it's one of them says, the world used to be really bad. Half of kids used to die before the age of 5. The world
Yeah.
is so much better. Only 5% die before the age of 5 now. And the world could still be so much better, if
Yes.
in sub-Saharan Africa or whatever, if they had the same percentage died before the age of 5 as Western Europe, then X amount of kids would die less per year or whatever. So it's like, it's kind of answering your question, which is like, oh, there is sadness, but it's answering it in like a very quantitative way.
Yeah, I mean that makes so much sense to me. And of course, I'm thinking about, so we've got the quant side. Now, what about the qual side?
Yeah.
Like, what is the experience of life, right? Like, you can live to your 190, but like, are those last 100 years enjoyable? Right? Like, what's the world that we live in? What's equity like? What's access to different resources like? There's so many ways of thinking about that question. But I'm suddenly reminded actually of a very kind of prototypical, a very typical kind of faith journey for young people who become very evangelical in evangelical Christianity, where in the early teens they'll have an experience or they'll become part of a community, which is amazing, and it really feels like they're on that train, right? Like going up, everything's improving, and it's really clear about what you need to do and what you don't need to do. And quite frequently, something in life will happen that does not fit with that community's values or theology. So someone's sibling comes out as trans, someone's best friend kills themselves, maybe they themselves have something that doesn't fit with the story of the community, and then you see people's understanding of the world change. And so I guess that's another piece of the puzzle for me, is for folks who are really excited about that kind of techno-utopian vision, is like, well, let's see who's here and who's not here, what life experiences are part of this conversation, and what isn't. Because if we're not fully speaking to a broad, and I don't want to say universal, but at least a broader segment of life, then I become hesitant about what the vision is. And that's not to undermine everyone's specificity. It's just like, what's the whole, right? We're seeing part of it, but what's the whole?
Totally.
Now I'm just preaching, so I apologize.
No, you're good. No, but I think it's interesting too, because I think there's like a side of it, which is that, the techno-utopian vision in some ways is super universal. It's super scale. It's like,
Yes.
let's make sure that we
Yes.
reach 1 billion users or whatever. And so there's like, yeah, but while doing that, you turn everything into an API and not an actual human.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think it's just
Right.
like a balance. And what this all makes me think about, and I think we're doing it to some extent in this conversation, but like, and people do this with like, oh, let's like have the left and the right chat with each other. Let's have, the atheist and the religion chat with each other. And I think like another version of that is like, how can the social justice activists chat with the techno-utopianists or whatever? And it makes me think about, there's this great essay by this woman, Renee DeResta, which is about mediating consent. And it's how back in the day, like you were talking about how we had, the Protestant form of religion, and it was kind of like pushed top down, and it was it went through the newspapers and TV and whatever. Like that's what we got. And now we have this bottom up networked individualism, and we have these new remixed intuitional religions that are a part of that. And so it's like, how can we still mediate between these communities, all these communities that you were talking about, the Discord and whatever? How can we actually like and how can they interact with each other in an actual positive way instead of like instead of dunking on each other on the internet,
That is a real question to figure out. I want to read this paper, and it makes so much sense that we are in a time of Joan Chittister, who's a Benedictine nun, and I'll just take a slight step to the side to explain why I want to share this quote. There used to be like hundreds of thousands of Catholic nuns in America. They set up hospitals, school systems, all sorts of things. At this point, there's less than 40,000, and the average age is like 79 or something. So this particular expression of religious life is coming to an end, right? The people who run those organizations fully understand that. They've grieved for it, and they've let go of what it was. And now we're very excited about what might come next, not for them, but for their tradition. So I love that. And Joan Chittister is one of these sisters, these nuns, and she says that the future of religious life, at least for the next couple of decades, is going to be a story of coming and going. That actually trying to build some solid institution now is fundamentally boneheaded. Like it's not going to make sense. And so we're kind of in this in between time of journeying together. And the question is, how will we be on the journey? And so maybe what you're pointing to is like, yeah, it can be exhausting talking across, these very different communities of like tech utopias and social justice advocates. And, but can we intentionally find a few friends to learn from and walk with, or, can we learn something beyond our own context, knowing that actually no one has the answer at this point. Like it just does not exist. I also don't want to paint a false parallel of like, let's just all get along better and find something new, which I'm at risk of doing. But I find it very helpful as someone who cares so much about this question that like, I am not going to start like the next institution, right? Like that's just folly to try and want to do that. But what I can do is have conversations, from which I learn and we hopefully find something new.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think, I think that's a good directional approach for us to take going forward. Do you think that are you seeing, by the way, any, like we've chatted about some of the bigger ones, these like new, bigger religions. Are there any, and especially like maybe at like, I don't know if you like see, do you know of any like, weird new experiments that are happening, or weird new like startup religions, or like anything through the Sacred Design Lab that's like happening on the ground that like may not be big now, but will be big in 10 years or something?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say there's a lot of people who, I'm sure you've been in 800 conversations of should we start a commune?
Currently living in one, Yeah.
Oh, amazing. Okay, great. So like, I think there's a lot of people intentionally cultivating a different way of life from what the dominant expectations are within society. I think 99% of them would not describe themselves as a new religion per se, and that's probably healthy. But what I am really interested in are what are models of new relational commitments that are being made. And to make that real, for example, one of my favorite organizations is Thread in Baltimore, Maryland, which on the surface is about supporting young people going through education. So the purpose of the nonprofit is to help young people who are at risk of dropping out of middle and high school to make it through graduation and into college. But the way that they do that is really interesting. They have 3 to 4 adult volunteers usually people who are newer to Baltimore. So they have higher incomes, higher levels of education, but lower levels of connection to the community and lower levels of feeling like their life is meaningful. They get that group of people together and surround one child, and the strategy is love. They have to spend at least 1 hour a week with the kid in person. They have to do for this child everything that they would do for their own child. So sure, you can help tutor math homework. You can, do other things that you would expect to see with reading and writing and whatever else. But you're also going to drive them to get the prom dress because they need a ride to get to the mall. You're also going to do A, B, and C, everything that you would do for your own kid, have them over for dinner, et cetera, et cetera. And what happens is that over those years, the relationships that have been committed to become part of someone's kind of essential framework of being part of the city, being part of the neighborhood, feeling connected across generations. And what I love about this organization, they don't just measure how many kids make it through high school and into college. They measure what it feels like emotionally for the volunteers who are part of it. So there's this multi-level kind of measurement system where they're able to see, like, this has changed the lives of all of these people. And so, again, they would never use religious language. But when I think about the best of what congregational life was, people felt part of something beyond themselves, which asked things of them that they would not necessarily want to do, right? We talk so much about, like, community is amazing. Community is also terrible because, like, you have to do shit you don't want to do.
Someone's got to clean up. Yeah.
Seriously, yeah. And so I love that this model, it basically helps people allow themselves to be asked things that are hard, and it makes everyone better. So those are some of the kind of things that I look at, and I'm like, there's something here that could really, right? And it's got that same small group model, so you can see some of the themes of the things that I really believe in. That's one example I get very excited about.
I like that. I think it and it makes me think about something that I actually wanted to hit on earlier, which is you talked about these, like, commitments that you have within community, and it makes me think of, again, as we think from the, like, quote unquote old religions to these weird new religions, the kinds of, like, old religions had, like, the 10 Commandments, like that's a legit thing. It's like, don't steal, don't, like, kill your neighbor. It's like, those are good things. And those were, like, actually very helpful to, like, create interpersonal trust between people.
Yes.
When you think about something that is sad these days, like, everybody's talking about, like, and rights were good. Like, the fact that we got rights is good. Like, the Bill of Rights is good. But also, like, what about duties? Like, what about our duties to each other? And so how do you think about, like, a distributed bill of duties? Like, what would you, if you could put 3 or 5 things on that, what would your, 3 to 5 things be?
Well, I'm going to avoid your question by offering a different vision, but I love that those two things go together, and you're absolutely right. One of the C word we're most familiar with in a religious context is commandments, exactly as you said. The other tradition that I'm really passionate about is covenant. Covenant, the first covenant.
What is that? What does that even mean? I don't even know.
Yeah, what does that mean? It's a great question. I mean, if you're familiar with the story of Noah, originally we encounter it as this agreement between God and Noah that, Noah will fulfill the commandments, and God will keep God's promise, right, of not destroying humanity again. That's a prototypical kind of early example. But in later religious communities, what covenant became was a way of agreeing, not necessarily on what we're going to do, because the world is uncertain, but an agreement on how we are going to be together. And so I love covenant because built into the model of jointly saying, well, what's important to us? Okay, I really need to hear, and not just, like, butcher paper agreements at the beginning of a workshop of, like, let's not interrupt each other and, like, but, like, a deeper level of engagement about what really matters to each of us and how we want to be together. Built into the model of covenant is not just the agreements that we make up front, but is a process in which we engage those agreements. So, for example, in my team at Sacred Design Lab, there's 3 of us. So it's a small enough team that we do this every single week. We read out loud our covenant, the agreements of how we're going to be together. And then we talk about it for 10 to 15 minutes of where did we fulfill our promise to one another? What can we celebrate? And where did we fall short? What do we need to pay attention to next time? And it is... the covenant works itself on us because it has shaped how we not only are with each other, but how we are in the world, because we've got this set of commitments and the structure of support and accountability to help us live that out. So I think one of the major challenges with a kind of commandment model is, first of all, that if you break the commandment, like, you are out. And with covenant, the job of the covenant is to expect that we're going to fall short. We're going to screw it up. That's part of who we are as human beings, right? And so how do we repair that? That becomes a crucial part of the process, is that we have to find our way back to each other. Now, there are, of course, limits to that. But at the same time, there are incredible stories of forgiveness and repair that inspire me, at least. So when I think about what are the ways in which we're going to hold one another, like what's that structure of rights and responsibilities, I think covenant is an extremely powerful thing. One of the things that scares me is, how do you do that at scale? Is there a size at which you can do that, and beyond that it's too big, and we have to go into a simple kind of rules oriented context? I don't know.
It's interesting because I think, if I'm hearing you correctly, the way I hear the difference between like a commandment or a duty to each other is like, the duty is, hey, here are these things, and like, don't break them, like, these are the rules, like, you point at them, like, you broke rule 7, versus a covenant, which is like, hey, we've all kind of co-agreed on these co-created things, and like, we're gonna see what our relationship to them is. And is that kind of the main difference?
Yeah, and maybe one thing I didn't say very clearly at all was that, in a traditional biblical context, the commandments came from God. And if you pissed off God, you're in trouble, right? Like, that whole worldview was built around an authority figure who could decide if you went to heaven or hell. And if you really believe that, boy, is that scary, right? Like, it's a social control mechanism that has power. Now, I'm assuming in your social world and in mine, that does not have a lot of power, right? Like, that assumption of a God on high who's sitting in a judgment seat when we die, no, it doesn't work. And so those commandments don't have power over us. And so covenant is really an alternative, in the sense that it's an agreement of mutual assent, right? That we are explicitly saying yes to this set of agreements, and therefore we feel responsible to the agreements because we were part of creating or consenting to them.
Beautiful. Yeah, no, that's very helpful. I think, right? That the commandments come from an authority figure, God, and if you break them, bad things, versus, hey, we've co-agreed in this bottom up thing. I do think, as you know, I just think that what would I say? I think covenant as a good, it's like this balance between the messy and the qualitative versus the kind of rules-based laws or code that are these things that can do the social control at a macro scale. And so I don't know. I think it'll be interesting to see what kinds of the bill of duties or distributed duties or covenants look like for folks. I think that'll be really interesting.
Look at what happened at Basecamp this month, right? Like, that was an organization that had started maybe with a commandment culture, had moved with dominant culture to question some of that, and it was becoming more peer-to-peer mediated. There were committees, and the people who had power were feeling their power undermined and wanted to reclaim it, and a third of the company resigned. And so I think that's where you can see that kind of two different ways of thinking about how this might work at play in a really concrete way.
Totally. Yeah, I like that. As we get into pseudo rap mode here, I want to ask one other question, which is, I think there's... So, I'm asking one other question, then we'll go to the final section. But this question is like, so we've chatted today a lot about the kind of like, what's new, like what's happening, what's the haps with the new stuff, versus the kind of, there's the downtrend of the old cycle. And this is, the poll recently about, 47% of Americans go to an organized church or mosque or synagogue. That's the lowest it's ever. It's the first time under 50%. And I guess my question is like, how do you think about the impacts of that side of things? And what for folks who are like either losing that or who are moving away? What's happening over there? Yeah, how do you think about that?
Yeah. There's pros and cons. I'm always very clear as a gay man of the benefits that certain oppressive forms of religion having less cultural power have had for me, literally in my life, and at the same time, many of the kind of relational infrastructure, right? What structures existed in people's lives that held them in community are declining. It's congregations, but it's also things like the Lions and the Elks Club. It's the PTA involvement, right? There's many things, those kind of community level organizations that are in decline, in part because women are in the paid workforce, so that these organizations couldn't depend on free labor of women, right? So there's structural reasons why this is the case. Beyond just the individual cultural changes. But it has meant, I think, that we are encountering people who we wouldn't choose to encounter less frequently. At its most beautiful, congregational life can mean that the head of the union is sitting next to the head of the owner of the factory, and that they are worshiping together to something bigger than themselves, and that changes the dynamic of then the negotiations on a Monday morning. That's an idealized picture, but it holds some truth. And when we are only associating with people we choose to associate with, though we may feel safer, though we may feel more comfortable, we also lose an element of what it means to live in society. And so I think the political polarization that you're seeing, I think the growth in the rates of loneliness and social isolation that you're seeing, I think those are absolutely connected to the decline of institutional religion. Maybe even this idea of, politics is religion without transcendence. Some of the intensity of the identity of Republicans versus Democrats, or even, within the parties, I think that's not unrelated.
Yeah.
But again, this is not the first time it's happened. Religion it's not a static thing. It's always evolving, and it's shaped by new technologies and the state of the economy, and in turn shapes them. So I don't want to paint this as something completely unique, although of course it is, just in terms of like the actual new technologies that exist. But religion will change, and it will mold, and it will in turn shape how we experience the world.
Yeah, I like that. I think. Yeah, and I think that what you're saying is A, to remember the old stuff. And I think that's just like reading stuff is so helpful for that. You're like, oh, wow, like these things happened in the 1800s isn't even that long ago. So it's like you can even look deeper than that. And so reminding ourselves of that, I think, is crucial. And I think what you said is true, which is like, yeah, the how to get folks, and this is back to the mediating consent question, and like how to like get folks back into digital civil society, in digital public spaces. Like how can we do that? That's up for debate. One final question here. We're going to do one overrated, underrated, which is,
great.
Do you think that the phrase "God is dead" and science slowly dismantling religion or whatever, do you think that's overrated or underrated?
I mean, obviously, I'm going to say overrated. I think all you need to do is walk into a hospital waiting room, or look at how someone feels when they're on an ayahuasca journey, or, like, God is alive in so many different places. If we think about what God is much more creatively, than I think, like, I'm glad the God of the old man in the sky is dead. Like, long live that death. But I think God, as God actually is very much alive.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, so like the God, capital T, capital G, God is dead, but like godliness or whatever is alive and well. Beautiful. Well,
Nice.
Casper, thank you for the conversation today. It was fun. I think that I'll be curious to see what you all continue to do with understanding the future of meaning and spirituality. Are there places where folks can check you out on the interwebs, or what any call to actions for folks?
Yeah, for sure. Check out Sacred Design Lab, which is sacred.design. And I've got a couple of podcasts where we talk about things like this. There's Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, and The Real Question, which you can find wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you want random things on Twitter from me, I'm at Casper TK.
Boom, beautiful. And is there anything, if you any as like anything that you would recommend to our listeners as they think about their own journeys with meaning into the new world? Any kind of slight bit of a one sentence recommendation or something?
I think we can trust our longings. That if we want to feel part of something bigger, closer to people we care about, closer to our own integrity, that wherever those longings take you, that they're trustworthy.
I love that. As a super mental person, it was always like, do the thing, make the spreadsheet or whatever. And then like I learned when I was like 25, we were like, trust your gut, man. Like it's pretty much right every time. Beautiful, Casper. Thank you for your conversation. Thank you for listening, folks, and see you next time. Goodbye.
Goodbye.